Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. And before we get to the main event, I'd like to take this opportunity, since it's our closing program, to thank several people without whom we would not have a conference and show. And there are innumerable people, and I'm going to forget some people, but these are the people that I want to at least shout out to. Barbara Lowe, who is our chair of the conference committee. Mary Beth Momsheimer, who is our administrative director, who does countless things for us in an excellent way. Tamar Zimmerman, who is in charge of exhibits and getting the cases and everything up, and amazing. The conference committee members who actually find out who we should have to speak and contact the speakers and work with the speakers. And those are Mike Pike, Dick Sheaf, Barbara Charles, Nancy Rosen, and Tamar Zimmerman, as well as, of course, Barbara Lowe, the chairman. And Dick Sheaf, who does the graphic design work for the conference materials that you see, the beautiful work that he does. We give him a applause for that. Diane DeBlois, who is our editor, and you wouldn't get those nice journals and that e-news without Diane's great work throughout the year. And Judith and Glenn Mason, who were extremely helpful with getting the auction going yesterday, which gave us a little bit of money, which we, of course, we always need, thanks to them. And now I would like to have the privilege of introducing someone here. I'm delighted to have with us today Will Shortz, the acclaimed crossword puzzle editor of the New York Times. Will is also the puzzle master on NPR. He owns a collection of more than 25,000 puzzle books and magazines. Let's think about that for a minute. They date back to 1533, before I was born. He has amassed a collection of thousands of pieces of puzzle ephemera. He will speak to us this morning on a century of crosswords, or the slight variant of that title that appears before you. And I'm really proud to mention that Will has been a longtime member of the Ephemera Society, and it's an honor to have him as a member. Ladies and gentlemen, Will Shortz.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Bruce. And you can all hear me all right? How many people here solve crosswords at least occasionally? Look at this, pretty good. How many have heard me on NPR on Sunday morning? Virtually. Or this morning, yeah, that's actually taped on Friday. That's why I can be here today. And Sudoku too. Yeah, I do basically any kind of puzzle. Well, today, let me start. I'm going to do a presentation, as you can see, on crossword ephemera from the past century. And crossword puzzles are the most popular puzzle in the world. More than 50 million Americans solve them at least occasionally. And I've been collecting puzzle ephemera and books and magazines since I was a child. I'm going to show you I'm going to tell you a little about the history of puzzles, the history of crosswords in particular, showing things from my collection. And I collect, as Bruce said, I have more than 25,000 puzzle books and magazines going back to 1533. I'm interested in all kinds of puzzles. I have probably tens of thousands of items of ephemera. And here's examples of some crossword items. Judge's crossword puzzle book from the 30s on the right. One of the nicest crossword magazines from the 30s and 40s, Championship Crosswords, and a pamphlet on the left with advertising Battleship Coffee. Well, you would think crossword puzzles would go back centuries, but in fact they were an invention in 1913 for the old New York World newspaper. They had a Sunday supplement called called Fun. It was edited by Arthur Wynn, and it was 8 to 16 pages. It ran from 1911 to 1916 in the Sunday newspaper that contained puzzles, riddles, jokes, cartoons. And on the Sunday before Christmas in 1913, Arthur Wynn, the editor of the section, created something he called a word cross puzzle. The first answer was filled in for you at the top. It was fun. It was in the shape of a hollow diamond. The clues were not in the were not set out in the modern format of with across and down. Instead, they had a number at the start and end of every answer, and so you see at the 1 at the top, the clue for that was at 1-32. And they hadn't mastered the numbers were so large you couldn't fill them in the squares. So that first puzzle was called a word cross puzzle. The second week, this was the Sunday before New Year's, it was called Fun's New Year Puzzle, Find the Missing Words. The third week, the puzzle was titled Find the Missing Crosswords. And by the fourth week, the modern name of the crossword had been adopted. It was Fun's Crossword Puzzle. And years later, the compositor of this section said that it was just by accident that he left off the name word cross the second week, and the name evolved into crossword, and that's what we've called it ever since. Well, the puzzle was a hit with readers from the start, and the puzzle continued as a weekly feature of Fun section until 1916, and after that, it continued when Fun, that section stopped. The crosswords continued in the New York World magazine, Sunday magazine, and here you can see they have the crossword puzzle corner. And the puzzle developed what they called a crank audience. You know, people loved the puzzle and were angry when it was omitted from the magazine or when there was an error in the puzzle. So the crossword continued through the teens and early 20s. In 1924, the New York World had 3 puzzle editors. They now had a full page of puzzles in the magazine each week. And the puzzle editors were Prosper Bernelli on the left, Margaret Petherbridge, who would later marry the publisher John Farrar to become Margaret Farrar, and F. Gregory Hartswick on the right. And 2 young graduates of Columbia Journalism School from the previous year, Dick Simon and Max Schuster, were starting a publishing firm. And one of them, Dick Simon's aunt, was one of those people in the crank audience of the crosswords in the world, suggested that they do a book of crosswords. So Simon and Schuster, starting their firm, went to the trio at the World and asked them to collect they took 75 crossword manuscripts out of a drawer in a desk and put together the world's first crossword book. It's called the Crossword Puzzle Book, first series. It was not only the world's first crossword book, it was the first publication of Simon & Schuster. It was in a hardback format, as you see. Puzzles inside look like this. And as a publishing gimmick, they had a Venus pencil bound into the book in the back. I have a special copy of this book. It's a special leather-bound copy of inscribed first copy of the first edition of the book, and it is inscribed by Dick and Max. It says, "To Aunt Wixie, whose idea, announced on January 3, and has finally taken material form in this first copy of the first edition of the first publication of Simon & Schuster, Inc., alias the Plaza Publishing Company. With many thanks, Dick and Max." And it's dated April 7, 1924, 5:52 p.m., ushering in the crossword puzzle era. The history of crosswords all along has been that this was a surprise success, But as this inscription shows, it was not a surprise to Dick and Max. They thought they were onto something big. Don't you love it when you buy a book and there is ephemera in it? And this book has some great ephemera. Inside this special copy of the book is a copy of a letter from Dick Simon to his father, thanking him for investing in Simon & Schuster. And also inside was a ticket to the first crossword convention in the next month. Well, the book came out in April 1924. It was advertised in the local papers, and the New York World and others, and here is an example advertisement for crossword fans for the crossword book. And Simon & Schuster just had a small office in New York at this time, and these ads invited people to send in money to get copies by mail. And the story is that one day, shortly after these ads appeared, and their office had like a mail slot in the door, and they had difficulty opening the door into their office because of the orders that were piling up behind it. So the crossword book was a huge success. This pamphlet put out by Simon & Schuster says, "Taking America by Storm." And inside, it advertises the 3 crossword books by the end of the year that Simon & Schuster had put out. And they were, as you see in the lower left, they were put in a box as a bound set. They also had crossword books for kids by the end of the year. And they were advertising Venus pencils, which were bound into the book, and Merriam-Webster Unabridged Dictionary on the lower right. By the end of the year, the 3 crossword books from Simon & Schuster ranked number 1, 2, and 3 on the national nonfiction bestseller list. And the crossword was a craze, just like, you know, Rubik's Cube, the hula hoop, the Macarena, or any craze that you can think of. So this happened in 1924. Within a year, I'd say virtually every daily newspaper in the country published a crossword puzzle. And the success of the Simon & Schuster book set off a national craze. Here's an advertisement from the New York Journal for a $30,000 prize crossword contest. And even today, $30,000 is a lot of money. And in 1924, it was an extraordinary amount. Judge Magazine, you'll find a lot of crossword ephemera from 1924 and 25 during the craze. Here's an example of Judge Humor Magazine with a crossword puzzle number, and it was filled with crossword cartoons and jokes. House Beautiful Magazine had their cover with a crossword motif. This is the world's first crossword magazine. Came out in March 1925, and the cover was the first crossword champion, who she won her name was Ruth Von Poole. She won the first crossword tournament in September 1924. And here they show her, it says, the champion trains for her next bout. She's lifting a dictionary on one hand and an encyclopedia on the other. There are lots of crossword postcards. Here's one, a comic one from the Tuck series. And the couple is, as you see on the table, so involved in solving a crossword that they are oblivious to their screaming child on the floor. There are also real photo postcards. I just got this a few weeks ago from Ben Swanson. And this is what the fashionable young man was wearing in 1924. There were lots of crossword songs. Here's one, crosswords with ukulele. And some of them came with records. This is my favorite title, Crossword Mama, You Puzzle Me, but Papa's Gonna Figure You Out. There's a crossword puzzle game from McLaughlin's. There were multiple copies of cards that came in the box, and you would hand these out to your party guests and have a crossword puzzle party at home. This is crazy. Crossword brand cigars. This is a crossword Christmas card from 1924. Kathleen Norris was a popular writer of the period. I think her husband was Charles. They were big crossword aficionados from the start. And for their Christmas card in 1924, they had a crossword puzzle with a grid on the front and the clues inside. This is how the clever solver cheated to solve crosswords. She has a wrist dictionary, which she's consulting in order to solve the puzzle. This is the sheet of clues for the world's first crossword championship. And I showed you before the Ruth Von Poole, who was on the cover of the Crossword magazine. She personally gave this to me in the 1980s at the championship round at the tournament. The two contestants stood at large boards and raced to complete the final puzzle. And this is the sheet of clues that she held in her hand to do the puzzle. They have an error there. They have a typo there. Cross World Puzzle Tournament. They did. I would have caught that if I. And Ruth Von Poole also gave me this. After she won her championship, a newspaper syndicate suggested that she edit a daily crossword for newspapers. And here is a pamphlet with the first week of puzzles promoting her series for newspapers. There was a show on Broadway called Puzzles of 1925, starring a famous singer and entertainer of the era, Elsie Janis, in which the climactic scene was set in a crossword puzzle sanatorium. At the start of 1925, Simon & Schuster put out a special book called the Celebrities Crossword Puzzle Book, in which every puzzle was reputedly created by a famous person. And Alfred Hitchcock has a puzzle in there, Bill Tilden, Governor Al Smith of New York, and lots of other famous people. And during that era, in the old times, the publishers sometimes would do special leather-bound copy of their book for the author. And I got this on ABE Books years ago. The bookseller knew it was a special copy of the book because it was leather-bound. The regular copy in the stores would have had a dust jacket and been with regular cloth binding. But so he knew this was special. He didn't know how special it was, though, because it was inscribed to Aunt Wixie and Uncle Al. Those are the aunt of Dick Simon, who suggested that Simon & Schuster do a crossword book. Well, the next section of I'll tell you different kinds of collectibles there are in crosswords. Obviously, there's books. Simon & Schuster crossword books ran from 1924 up to the early 2000s, up to around 270 or 280. And I do have a complete run of the books, and I believe I'm the only person in the world to have a complete run of the Simon & Schuster crossword books. They started in hardbound format, as you see in the left, and then to spiral bound later on. The middle volume there is a special 50th anniversary of the crossword series, and on the left is another example of it. This is an unusual book called The Crossword Tracer, and it came with cellophane paper cut into squares, and you would place that paper over your grid and solve it on the transparent sheet, And then when you were done, you could remove the sheet, and your friend or family member could also solve the puzzle. The book would get multiple use. Vincent Fuller had a crossword mystery called The Long Green Gaze, and occasionally through the book, crossword puzzles would be slipped under someone's door containing clues to the mystery. This is America's first crossword magazine. It was put out by Dell, which still publishes crossword magazines today. It came from 1931. Since it was the first one, there was no need for Dell to put their name on the cover. It was simply Crossword Puzzles magazine. Right. So originally the name was Crossword, 2 words. Then it became hyphenated. It was entered into the Merriam-Webster Unabridged Dictionary in 1927. And it was a gradual thing. I'd say by the late 1920s, most people were doing it as a solid word, unhyphenated word. Yeah. It was like an email, you know. First of all, it was hyphenated, and now, you know, no one puts a hyphen in email. Here's the 10th issue of Dell Crossword Puzzles, and particularly they had great covers in the days. Here is a newsstand poster for that issue of the magazine. If you go to the newsstand, this poster would be put up to encourage people to buy the magazine. I'm a serious collector of old crossword magazines, and I'm especially interested in ones up to 1970, but really I'll buy them from any era. During the 30s and 40s, there were some wonderful covers on crossword magazines. This was one during early World War II, where the sailor is being visited by a mermaid, but he is so involved in his crossword, he doesn't care about this half-nude mermaid. And Crossword Pastime magazine had a very Norman Rockwell-esque cover. Barbara's a little too involved in that puzzle. Oops, sorry. There were 2 jumbo crossword puzzles put out in the 1930s, each in an envelope, and you'd open it up, and there was this gigantic crossword. At the time, I think this was the world's largest crossword puzzle. Now that record has been superseded numerous times. In 1933, there was a national craze for jigsaw puzzles because there was technology had been created to make them on cardboard instead of having to be done with wood through an actual jigsaw. And so this combines the 2 crazes with jigsaw puzzle and a crossword. You get a sheet in the box where you could solve the puzzle, and if you have trouble, you could put together the jigsaw part of the puzzle to get the solution. Here's the world's first crossword dictionary called Words to Aid the Puzzled. Lots of ads in the 1920s contain crossword motifs, and here's one from the Saturday Evening Post advertising 3-in-1 oil, in which much of the crossword is about oil. Crossword cartoon from 1924, and it's not bad. Gasoline Alley, it's a classic comic strip. And the guy on the left says, "So the crossword puzzle bug hasn't bitten you yet, Walt?" And Walt says, "No, Mr. Wicker, somebody's got to stay sane around this alley." So Walt goes home, he gets a phone call. "Hello, Walt, this is Phyllis. I've got to have some help tonight from some smart man on some crossword puzzles. Couldn't you come over?" So Walt's there. "Golly, Phyllis, I didn't think they were so hard. I can't find any word for arbitrate with S, the 3rd letter." And Phyllis says, "You did nicely on annul and importance and plus. See if you can find an African fish of 7 letters." And Walt at the end is stumbling home in the dark, says, "Word ending in ION with a B and an L in it. Sounds like ablution, but it isn't." And the title of the comic strip is, it's like a cold, don't get exposed. In 1936, Liberty magazine had a crossword contest that went for 10 consecutive weeks in the magazine. In the first week, the cover of the magazine has the first puzzle in the series, and so you would have to buy the magazine for 10 consecutive weeks, solve all the puzzles, and send your answers in for, for a large amount of money. Now, as I mentioned before, most newspapers in America started a crossword in 1924, 25, or maybe 26. The holdout was the New York Times. They never published comics, and the Times held itself out as being a more serious, solemn newspaper than other papers. But by 1942, the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, decided it was high time that the Times itself start a crossword. The story is that he was tired of buying the competing Herald Tribune to get their crossword. Probably apocryphal, but the Times had the good sense to ask as their first crossword editor Margaret Farrer, the one who had edited or co-edited all the crossword books up to that time. And Margaret's idea was that the Times crossword should be a step up from everybody else's, should have more intellectual and cultural rigor than other puzzles. This is a Sunday, the puzzle started on a Sunday, just Sunday, once a week in 1942. And at the start of World War II, the publisher's thought was people are going to be diverted or going to be worried so much about the war and they're going to need relief. So the Times introduced a crossword page in the magazine. The main crossword was at the top of the page, and at the bottom there was a variety puzzle, in this case, a puns and anagrams puzzle. Margaret Farrer edited the Times crossword from 1942 up till 1969. The daily puzzle, weekday puzzle, was introduced in 1950. This is an article about her from Avenue magazine in the 1970s. And you see her working at home on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, surrounded by books. And she told me she liked to distribute her reference books around her apartment, which would force her to get up and walk around during the day. I collect ephemera from any important ephemera, including correspondence from Margaret. I have all my own letters from her, but here is a special letter to her, from her to Doris Nash Wertman, who did the double acrostics for the Times and the Saturday Review of Literature for years and years. And this letter is inviting Doris to submit crosswords to the Simon & Schuster crossword books. Margaret was succeeded by Will Weng as crossword editor at the Times. He was there from 1969 till 1977. Before he became crossword editor, he was the head of the Times' Metropolitan desk. He was a newsman, but he had been making crosswords for years for the Times. He had a great sense of humor. He was the person who introduced humorous themes into the crosswords. This is Will Weng. This is an example of two big collecting areas colliding. It's a childhood scrapbook of Will Weng's collecting Sam Lloyd puzzles from his local newspaper in Terre Haute, Indiana. Weng was succeeded by Eugene T. Mileska from 1977 till 1993. Here's an article about him in a magazine. And unusual thing about Mileska, he was a teacher in the Bronx, and then became a superintendent of schools in the Bronx. And when he retired, there was a school in the Bronx named after him, Eugene T. Mileska School. And after the school was named after him, there was such an uproar that he was the first person first living person in New York City ever to have a school named after him. And there was such an uproar about that that the rule was changed, so it will never happen again. And but here is a school yearbook from 1979 for Molesca School, and it has a crossword motif, as you can see. Since I've been the crossword editor at the Times since 1993, I also founded and directed the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament in 1978, which I've run every year. And I have a lot of crossword ephemera and memorabilia of my own. And here's one special item I'll show you. It's a letter from Bill Clinton on my 50th birthday. And he wrote, and Bill Clinton, as you may know, is a serious crossword fan. He sometimes does as many as 3 or 5 puzzles a day when he's on the campaign trail. In this letter, he wrote, "Dear Will, happy 50th birthday. The 50s have their rewards along with their constant, sometimes irritating reminders of the ticking clock. The Cherokees, who gave me a trace of their blood, believed a man didn't reach full maturity until 51, something to look forward to. Meanwhile, keep the crosswords coming. Even when I can't finish them, they're the only part of the Times that guarantees good feeling." Guarantees good feeling. I collect crossword and puzzle memorabilia from all over the world. I told you, the crossword craze in America was 1924 and 25. The craze immediately jumped to Europe and then spread around the world. Here's a copy of La Vie Parisienne magazine from May 1925 with a crossword cover. This is France's first crossword puzzle book, and the puzzles are all by Tristan Bernard, who is one of France's most famous writers of the early 20th century. And for him to do this book of crosswords would be like Ernest Hemingway or John Faulkner in the United States doing a book of crosswords. What did I say? Sorry, John Faulkner, yes. Here's a crossword medal from a French crossword tournament, Mots Croisés, and it has Tristan Bernard's name on the medal. Here's this one. I collect crossword magazines from all over the world. This is one from the Czechoslovakia from 1945, just after the war. Česká křižovka a hádanka, which means crosswords and puzzles. Here's something unusual. It's it's a famous Romanian writer, Tudor Arghezi, and if you look him up, you'll find he's one of the most famous writers in Romania. And in the 1930s, he did a crossword collection, which you can see on the left. That's an original copy of it. During the communist era in the 1980s, the main publishing house wanted to collect all the writings of Tudor Arghezi, his novels and his articles, and they did a series of all his books, and as part of that, they included his crossword book. But there were things, they revised his writing to edit out things that would have been offensive to the communist government. Now, if you're editing a novel or a regular writing, it's fairly easy to remove something you don't like. It's not so easy to do that with a crossword if there's an answer in the grid that you don't like. But that, in fact, is what the communist publishers did. If you look, this is the same puzzle. The title is Politics, and somebody has gone into the grid and revised the grid to remove the offending terms. One of the most famous or notable crosswords in Britain was the one in the Listener magazine, which is the magazine of the BBC. This is from 1979, their 2,500th crossword. And I have a collection of Stephen Sondheim's solved copies of the puzzles from the 1930s through the 1970s, which he himself gave me. I'm going to conclude by telling you the 10 most unusual items in my crossword collection. Number 10 is a crossword bracelet. I got this on eBay in 1997. The dealer thought it was from the 1960s. That has enamel, little tiny crossword grids of enamel connected by silver. The dealer suggested that it wasn't, didn't know when it, where, she didn't know, the dealer didn't know when it was from, but suggested it was the 1960s. I knew, here's a beautiful close-up of the bracelet. I knew the bracelet was from 1925 because I have an advertisement for it in the back of a book. I put in a ridiculous bid. You know, do you do that? Put in ridiculous bids for something you really, really want. I was the only bidder, so I got it for a good price. Number 9 is a real photo postcard of Violet and Daisy Hilton. They were Siamese twins from Britain. They were born, I think, in the early teens, and from an unwed mother. She sold her daughters to a couple who put them on tour for money. They were like a circus act. And they toured the world, actually. And here they are on a trip to the United States. The one on the left, Violet, had learned jazz, so she was playing the saxophone, and Daisy on the right is solving a crossword on the wall. Number 8 is a crossword puzzle solving aid, and the idea is that you have these strips of letters which you move up and down. If you're solving a crossword and you've got an 8-letter answer, for example, where the first 3 letters are S-O-L and the last 4 are T-I-O-N, and you arrange your strips like that, and then you move the 4th strip up and down to figure out what the missing letter is. It's hard to imagine that, can't you just do this in your head? Number 7 is a crossword quilt. This was from the 1930s, and it was for a crossword contest in the Chicago Tribune. They had a contest where for 48 consecutive days, there was a contest crossword in the newspaper where you would solve the puzzle and you'd collect your solutions to all 48 puzzles and send them in at the end. And if there was a tie for accuracy, they awarded first prize to the person who had the nicest handwriting or the neatest entry. And this person, instead of handwriting all their answers, they needle stitched them into a quilt. Each puzzle is on a different state. This one puzzle is number 10 is on Missouri. They have an outline of it in the middle, and you see the answer Missouri vertically on the left. And I hope this person won because that is an incredible amount of work. It's from Mrs. F.B. Towsley from Downers Grove, Illinois. I hope she won, and it's very nice that somebody at the Tribune saved that. Number 6 is a crossword pail. Circa 1930, there is a grid on the front. The clues are on the side, and the answer is, if you needed it, was on the bottom of the pail. Number 5 is a printing plate from the New York Times with Will Wing's picture on it. And in the old days, before electronic printing, everything was done with printing blocks. And this was Will Wing's picture as the paper went through the press, the paper would be impressed on this photo, and that's how Will Wing's picture appeared in the newspaper. Number 4 is the original artwork for 50 Crosswords magazine from the late 1940s. You see the artist has left space at the top for the title of the magazine, and I mentioned before that Norman Rockwell-esque cover of Crossword Pastime magazine. I thought that was a really nice cover. I think this is a really stupid one because look at that boy at the right. You know, no one stands like that looking through a dictionary. It's just too contrived. But it's nice framed artwork. Number 3 is the Kix cereal box from the late 1940s. There were 6 of them. Collect all 6. All the clues were in picture form, which is kind of nice. There's no written clues. You would look, you see that picture, you see a tiger with a 5-letter answer for one across, and there were 6 of them. Collect them all. Number 2 is a crossword license plate. I have, this is the smallest part of my crossword ephemera collection, puzzle-related license plates. I have 3 of them, and if you or someone has a puzzle-related license plate that you no longer use, please save it for me. And the last thing is the largest item in my crossword collection. It's crossword pinball machine, put out by Williams in 1957. So I'll tell you about this. Evie and I were shopping at Renninger's years ago. I'm walking along the aisle, and I look right, and there is this crossword pinball machine, and I do a double take, and I know I have to have this machine. So I go into the dealer, and as nonchalantly as I can, I ask how much this is. And you know how antique dealers do? He says, 2. So what does 2 mean? Does it mean 200? Does it mean 2,000? How much am I willing to spend for this crossword pinball machine? So as the conversation develops, it is 200. So thank you very much. I got it for $200. Had to take it apart in order to put it in my car and get it home. But it's in my basement. And when I started editing crosswords for the Times in 1993, I was all alone. I was the only person doing it. And I would be upstairs editing, and every time I finished editing a puzzle, I would go into my basement, and as my reward, I could play a game. And the object was to have the ball go down holes in on the main surface of the pinball machine. And if you can complete a word on the board, then you'd win a free game. Of course, mine was set up so I can play as often as I want at no cost. So there you go. There are some things from my crossword collection. Do we have time for any questions? Yes, we have time for just a couple. Go ahead. Do I have crossword puzzle pajamas? Yes, I have. People have crossword plates, crossword clock. Yeah, crossword stockings. Who is it? Absolute Vodka had a series of ads, and they had one crossword stocking. So I've got Absolute crossword stockings. Yes. Are crosswords always symmetrical? Basically, the answer is yes. Usually that means that if you rotate the diagram 180 degrees, the pattern of black squares will look the same. Once in a while, you'll see left-right symmetry, but usually it's 180 degrees rotation. And it's interesting, crosswords develop that very early in the teens. And that same standard, that same rule has become standard throughout the world, no matter what the language and no matter what the culture. With a few exceptions, most countries have symmetrical crosswords. And I think the reason is a crossword grid that's symmetrical is more visually attractive, more aesthetic. It's more likely to draw the solver in. And also, I think crossword makers, part of the reason we love crosswords is the constraint. And crossword makers like constraints, and one of those would be symmetry.
I recently came across a puzzle from the 70s, and it wasn't meant to be difficult, but it had a lot of references to politicians or current events of the day, which would be obscure trivia.
Okay, so the question is, don't know if you all heard it. In the 1970s, the crossword he was doing had references to things during the day which are obscure now. And the early crosswords had nothing current in them. They were just words from the dictionary. They didn't allow phrases, didn't allow names, really. And if there was a girl or woman's name, it wouldn't say actor, actress, whatever. It would just say girl's name. That was what the clue would be. Over time, I'd say in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, puzzles became a little more relevant. Um, I work very hard to have my crosswords be timeless. So I'd like a New York Times crossword to be able to be solved 5 or 10 years from now and not look stupidly old. Because the Times crosswords are reprinted in book form and they're online, they appear for years, will continue to appear for years, and I want them to not feel out of date, and I also don't want to have to go in myself and have to keep changing them. I want them to be timeless. Yeah?
What do you have in your collection from 1533?
What do I have? A collection from 1533. Obviously not crosswords. It's a collection of riddles in Latin, published in current, what is now Germany. Yeah. First of all, and since many of you here are ephemera dealers, of course, if you find anything related to crosswords that's old, I'd very much like to hear about it. But I'm also very interested in anything with Sam Lloyd. I mentioned he was big from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Very interested in him. And I'm also historian for the National Puzzlers League. If you ever see anything related to a National Puzzlers League or any puzzle league, I'm the person to talk about that. Uh-huh. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll tell you a story about Bill Clinton, and I hope we have time. It was in 1992. I was the editor of Games magazine, and the publisher was a good friend of Bill Clinton's and knew that he solved crosswords. So we thought it would be cool to have a crossword in the magazine that he had solved, and we'd put his time. So another editor at the magazine, Mike Shank, who's now crossword editor at the Wall Street Journal, Mike made a crossword that would appear in the magazine, and our publisher set up a meeting at a hotel in Manhattan when Clinton was there. This was just before, it was after he had cinched the nomination for presidency, but before he was actually nominated at the convention. So we meet at his hotel, and we sit down, the three of us sit down, and we start interviewing him, and I ask I remember my first question was, well, how many crosswords do you do? And it was like he took him, he was kind of startled by the question. Out of all the people who had ever interviewed him, no one had ever asked how many crosswords he did. But after he saw that I was earnest, he gave me an answer. I interviewed him for a minute or two, and then he had the crossword on his lap that we had brought, and he started to solve it. And he said, you can continue to ask me questions. You know, he's definitely a multitasker. But no, we wanted to find out how fast he could do the puzzle without interruption. So Mike and I shut up as he is solving, and Clinton had clicked on his watch timer as he started the puzzle. He's working along, and the phone rings, and Aide comes in and says an important call he has to take. So Clinton clicks off his watch timer, goes over to a table, takes the phone. Mike and I are sitting, cooling our heels till the call's over. To our astonishment, while Clinton is on the phone, he clicks his watch timer on again and is solving the puzzle. A little while later, he clicks it off, and when the call's over, he comes over and shows that he has finished the puzzle perfectly in 6 minutes and 54 seconds. I won't tell that part. In the back. What's the process for crossword creation? Most crosswords, as you know, have themes. So you start with your theme. I mentioned that a crossword grid is symmetrical, so if that means if you have an 11-letter answer in 3 rows down on the upper left part of the grid, you have to have an 11-letter theme answer in the lower right portion of the grid, symmetrical to it. You put in your theme answers, you plot your pattern of black squares around, and then you actually fill the grid with your vocabulary. You start with the most constrained places first. If you have an answer because of your theme answer that has a 4-letter word ending in Q, you should start there because you don't have many possibilities. Fill the grid with as interesting, colorful, juicy vocabulary as you can, and at the end you write your clues. And it's just the opposite of how you solve a puzzle. You start with your clues, you go to the grid, you figure out the theme. If you're making, you figure out the theme, fill the grid, write the clues. Well, that was fantastic. Yeah, Rachel Maddow. We have, for the last year in the New York Times, we've been running a series of celebrity crosswords where I pair up famous people who solve the New York Times crossword with regular Times contributors. And these are all genuine collaborations. Unlike that celebrities crossword book from 1925, Margaret told me most of those were sham. You know, maybe Bill Tilden suggested putting in a couple of words, and the editors created a good crossword using those few words. In our collaborations, the two people actually work together. And in this case, Rachel Maddow got together with Joe DiPietro, who's one of the Times' best crossword constructors. And before she started, she downloaded software onto her computer. She was serious about learning how to do a crossword. They did this terrific puzzle, which appeared a couple of weeks ago in the Times, and it was very cool. She mentioned it at the end of her show one night. Right before she went away for her last commercial, she said, she teased it and said, "I got some news to tell you. It's kind of embarrassing, but I'll tell you about it when we come back." And she came back, talked about again that she's embarrassed to tell it because what a nerd she is. But she had created this crossword with Joe. She mentions Joe's name, mentions my name, and the puzzle appeared in the Times on Friday, and it was a really nice puzzle too. Yeah, maybe one or two more questions. Yes, how is it stored? Good question. Well, with the quantity that I mentioned, it's all over my house. When I bought my house in 1993, I turned the master bedroom into my library and had bookcases built in by an architect, beautiful cherry bookcases. So my library is stored there. Books are in alphabetical order, organized by type. I have drawers with ephemera. My attic has a lot of stuff. My basement has a lot of stuff. Hmm. Yeah, interesting. I guess you all heard that. Governor Sununu was a crossword doer. I should invite him. Is he still alive? Should invite him to do this celebrity series. Gotcha. Aha. Thank you. Uh, and I did not ask for this question, too. Is there anything that I'm seeking? There are two things. Big thing is anything to do with Sam Lloyd, L-O-Y-D. He was my childhood hero. He was a puzzle maker from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I have the largest collection of that, but I'm always looking. The other thing is I'm the historian for the National Puzzlers League. And this will be the last thing I tell you. And the magazine, there's a magazine called, our journal is called The Enigma. And back in the early days, it was called the Eastern Enigma because it was just for the eastern half of the United States. In 1966, there was an old member of the league who had a complete series of the magazine that he wanted to sell, get rid of. So he had a notice in the magazine that said the magazine's, the full run was for sale, and he would donate 10% of the proceeds to the league. 6 months later, there was a notice in the Enigma of a donation from this old member to the league. So we know he sold the magazines, we know how much they were sold for, but no one knows who they went to. And of course, all the members from that period have been contacted, and no one knows where they went. And there are 17 early issues of the Eastern Enigma that are no longer known to exist. Those are the last known copies. So if anyone ever found the Eastern Enigma or any old copies of the Enigma, I would be most interested in those. Excuse me? They started in 1883. And the issues that are missing are from the 1800s. Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you all. Thanks a lot.